Hello, and welcome back to the world of Wysteria. This afternoon, we will be reading chapter 42, which is the final chapter of the adventure. This chapter will be broken into 3 parts. Wysteria, chapter 42. With Anton's sword in one hand and Emily in his other, Will allowed Wysteria to call him home. But something was wrong. Though he moved into the darkness, he remained there, suspended, unable to break free of Nathan's world. What was holding him back? Certainly not Emily. And he'd traveled with relics before, even unfamiliar ones, like Jeremy's dagger. Even so, he considered letting go of the sword. It was Anton's, after all. There might be some tie between them. It's the guard's hand, he suddenly realized. Should he fall back into the dungeon and remove the severed hand from its steel cuff? No, he couldn't take the chance. Nathan might well have returned by now. He might have no other choice, however. Will had been aiming for his balcony. It was where he and Emily usually landed when they returned from one of their excursions. Perhaps, if he focused his attention on his anchor, the pull would be stronger. But strong enough, he wondered. Holding tightly onto Emily, he filled his mind with thoughts of the fountain, not merely its image, but the sound of its gentle rain, the feel of the effervescent water running through his fingers, the wonder he felt when he first saw it, the day Iris had shown him the way, the day Wysteria was born. The tug-of-war began, his anchor fighting to reel him in, while Nathan's world held fast to its property. Will's mild discomfort quickly became intense pain as he felt himself being stretched, first taut, then to his limit. Then something snapped, and Will flew through the void. There was darkness and motion, and a moment later, he found himself in the square next to the fountain, with Emily, the sword, the shackles, and the drifter's hand. Taking care not to release her, Will set down his weapon and gently laid Emily on the ground, placing her head in his lap. "Are we home?" she asked, straining to peer at her surroundings. "Yes, my love," he told her. "Good," she sighed, letting her heavy eyelids fall shut. Emily needed to return to the waking world and sleep soundly in her bed. But their enemies, perhaps Anton, who knew the way here, could be close behind them. The dark entity that had stolen her away might still be lurking in the twilight, ready to snatch her again. In fact, someone was here. But as Will reached for the sword, he recognized the vibration as Jeremy's. The signal waned, then grew stronger, and seconds later, their immortal friend stood in front of them. Jeremy smiled, looking relieved to see them here, both in one piece. His eyes then followed the chain from Emily's wrist to the lifeless hand. So, it was a chain, not a rope, he observed. "Yes," said Will, I had to improvise. And Charlotte, he asked. She's still there, as far as I know, Will answered. They were holding off the guards while we made our escape. They? Yes, he said. She and Daniel. Daniel? The bounty hunter? Our scout, said Will. He quickly explained how Daniel had become part of the operation. Not only did he scout the location for us, he escorted us there, Will told him. Without his help, I doubt I could have gotten Emily out of there. Will lifted Emily's head from his lap and laid it carefully on the ground. He took hold of the chain, then stood. Can you watch her? He said. I have to go back for them. Can you get there, unaided? Jeremy asked. Will had forgotten that he no longer had a guide. Even if he were able to jump from Wysteria, it was doubtful he could find Nathan's world on his own. Maybe not, he said, but I have to try. Jeremy nodded. Yes, I suppose you do. Will reached down and picked up the sword. Jeremy eyed the weapon quizzically. It's Anton's, Will explained, or it was. A good trade, he remarked. Jeremy then looked at the severed hand. Are you going to return that to its owner? He asked him. I wasn't sure how that worked, said Will. Yes, I guess I should let him have it back. You shouldn't have been able to do that, you know. You mean cut it off? Will asked. No, Jeremy replied. Leave Nathan's world with it. You never fail to surprise me. There was no time to think about that now. As each second passed, Will became more worried about his friends. He started to hand the chain to Jeremy, but paused, for he felt it, the slight disturbance, and two vibrations. Charlotte? Jeremy asked. Yes, he said. And someone else. Will hoped it was Daniel, not another drifter she had taken for a ride. They're in the castle. The balcony, I think. We can go to them, said Jeremy, offering Will his hand. No, they left. Will turned and looked behind him. They're coming, he said, as both his comrades materialized near the southern gateway. Thank God, cried Charlotte, breathing hard and holding the blood-stained dagger in her hand. She ran over to them and dropped down next to Emily. When I didn't see you at the castle. So you made it, Will said to Daniel, who now approached. Barely, and thanks to her, he replied. She was a holy terror back there. He looked exhausted. His face was bruised, and he walked with a slight limp. Charlotte, too, wore the scars of the struggle. She was bleeding from her lip, and there were bruises on her arms. I'm glad you offered to hang around, said Will. Your timing was perfect. I missed the first few minutes of the fight, Daniel told him. After I dropped you off, I checked on the guards in the hall. 2 more had joined them. Rather than warn you, I tried to buy you more time. I jumped into the hall around the corner from them and made a commotion, yelling that there were trespassers upstairs, that Nathan needed all hands. Then I ducked into one of the rooms. I heard them run past the door, but then they stopped. Anton ordered 2 of the men to see what was happening, while he and the others headed back to their post. Daniel's quick thinking had bettered their odds, and the time he'd bought them was precious. "I'd love to stay and chat," said their scout, and twice savior it now appeared. "But I need to shed this body." "I understand," said Will. "Please come back tomorrow. I'm sure Emily will want to thank you once I tell her everything you've done." "No thanks needed," he replied. "But yes, I'll come by. I want a chance to apologize to her for my earlier misdeeds. I may take tomorrow off, though." Charlotte stood up and gave Daniel a hug, telling him they would talk soon as well. Then, saying goodbye to his new friends, and with a nod to Jeremy, who'd remained silent during their conversation, Daniel returned to his bed. "You were indeed fortunate to have found him," Jeremy remarked when he'd gone. "I'm glad we decided to trust him," said Will. "It was a tough call at the time, but it seemed to be the only—" Will stopped, hearing a rumble like distant thunder. Then the ground shook. The sky began turning an eerie shade of green, and a palpable clamminess filled the square. "What's going on?" Charlotte asked uneasily. "I don't know," said Will. Something was disrupting his world, but what it was... "You should leave, dear," Jeremy told her. "She is coming." "Who?" she asked. "I suppose it's just as well," he said, a faint smile on his lips. "The matter has to be settled." "Heiress?" pronounced Will. "Yes," said Jeremy. "The Queen herself has come to call on us." And that concludes part 1 of chapter 42, and we will return with part 2.